This is an incredibly important episode of the Procurement Reimagined podcast. I've got Austin and Liam from Mazars, based in Ireland, and we're going to be talking about DORA. And this is a new regulation that is going to impact financial services institutions across the EU and have some wider effect. The UK will obviously be affected by it, and countries outside of the EU. And it's very important for vendor management, contract management, legal teams to really get on top of this. There are some big requirements when it comes to managing your vendors, due diligence, and those contracts you put in place with your vendors. So this episode is an overview of DORA, some specific challenges, and some best practices that the team at Mazars are working on right now with their clients. Enjoy.
So I am in McKenna. I'm a partner with Mazars in Ireland, and I work internationally as well. I've been in the space of information security, digital resilience since the late 90s, and I'm really focusing on DORA since in maybe early 2023, which is really an extension of all of the work I've done over 2 decades or more.
Hi, I'm Austin Kelly. I'm a manager in Liam's team, born in the 90s rather than starting work in the 90s. Similar to Liam, I started working in kind of operation resilience and DORA kind of at the beginning of last year, kind of working through gap analysis implementation projects since then. But
yeah,
excited about DORA.
I didn't want to gang up on you here, Liam, but I was also born in the 90s, much like Austin. So it's always wild to hear. Yeah, they were good intros for sure. And so DORA, it sounds big, it sounds scary, it sounds like people have probably got a lot to do. Could you start off by maybe giving an overview of what this is and who it's going to affect?
And look, maybe I'll just give the context before maybe Austin can jump in on the overview. What organizations probably need to recognize is that digital risk has increased substantially over a number of years. And, you look at AI and the use of AI now for malicious purposes and attacks becoming much more sophisticated. You look at the volume of attacks that are going on, from very script kiddie type attacks to very, very sophisticated attacks. You look at, I suppose, the potential that we've reached and gone beyond peak globalization and are breaking back up into nation states with contention there and all that we know about across the globe. So the environment has become a lot riskier, and I think DORA is part of the response to that and ensuring that organizations don't just stay with their ISO 27001 and the sorts of things they were doing 10 years ago, which isn't really going to cut it. Maybe Austin to jump in a little bit more around the structure of it and the introduction to DORA.
Yeah, can do. As Liam mentioned, kind of at a European level, DORA has come in, kind of European Commission in 2023, really kind of looking at kind of harmonizing what is currently in place from regulation perspective, and really kind of bringing all that together into one kind of unified rule book for organizations to follow. So really kind of structured across 5 key pillars, but really the most important one, I think, is the ICT risk management. Obviously, this is looking at addressing some of the issues that Liam had mentioned around digitalization and AI and changes to the attack landscape. Outside of that, we're kind of looking at kind of issues of ICT, incident management and reporting. Again, consequences of having kind of failures in your risk management, leading to attacks, leading to reporting. Similarly, digital operation resilience testing, conducting these testings, making sure your environment's secure, if not, reporting it. And then ICT third-party risk kind of being one of the other pillars. So again, not just looking at risk internally, but also looking at where you're outsourcing, using ICT third-party service providers, what's the risk associated with that. So that's really kind of a lot of the structure of what DORA is kind of built upon, and then kind of the core elements of that.
And I think actually there is some benefit potentially for both consumers and for financial institutions. From a consumer perspective, it means that now there is a higher baseline benchmark across Europe. So, if you're using services, you're in Ireland, you're using services of a bank in Spain or in Germany or an insurance company, you know that the level of protection is going to be somewhat similar. And from a financial institution perspective, obviously the bar is being raised significantly, and we can get into that. However, it then maybe takes away some of the complexity of having to deal with point laws across different jurisdictions and making decisions around, do we do the German version or the Spanish version, or do we do both and try and separate our operations, which just isn't effective. So, it is creating a consistency, and this harmonization is consistent with all of the harmonization across Europe, which allows us to trade freely, move people freely, move money freely, and now, move data freely, obviously the GDPR, but also regulations such as DORA help this.
Yeah, that was a really nice overview, and I'll hold my tongue on the UK and EU just there, because there were some really good benefits there, especially around harmonization. In terms of non-compliance, what's the deal there with DORA? Are there penalties? What are the implications? That'd be really cool, because I think that's what people almost default to when they're like, oh, how seriously do we need to take this?
Yeah. And look, there are penalties, but I suppose the impact for an organization not complying with DORA is your relationship with the regulator in your market. If you start getting Dear CEO letters from your supervisor, if they're asking you questions and identifying that you haven't complied with DORA, it's the same. That's the same impact as not complying with consumer protection regulations or whatever it may be, in that you're going to damage your relationship with the regulator. That's going to bring greater focus onto your entity. You're going to end up getting into remediation programs, and you're going to end up having to do probably a lot of work in a much shorter period of time, potentially with a third party oversight that you're paying for, that the regulator is appointing. So, from that perspective, that's the same impact as any other regulation. And what it ends up doing is it takes the change capacity within your organization that you may have been anticipating applying to a business project that's going to drive revenue or reduce cost, and it's removing that, and it's saying, well, no, hang on, we now have to prioritize something that we didn't want to, without having the right level of planning associated with it, and all of that cost. So I think that's a general point, which maybe could apply to many different regulations. So there are some specific penalties around DORA, Austin.
There are indeed, yeah. And I suppose just to go back, so your financial entities, so your credit institutions, trading ventures, that sort of thing, the fine structure for those is set out to be effective and dissuasive. So there's no kind of percentage allocation to it, but they use some pretty scary words.
Yeah.
So as well as kind of the remediation projects that Liam had indicated, there's also pretty scary words to worry about. Outside of that as well, there's this kind of concept within DORA of critical ICT third-party service providers. So these are like specific ICT providers who, maybe are very difficult to kind of change. So you're kind of locked in with this provider. They're the only provider that provides this service. Maybe they're systemically important, or they're used by systemically important kind of institutions. They can get fines which are issued daily. So a daily fine, which is based off of 1% of their daily annual turnover from the year before. So again, that's a continuously adding on fine until compliance is attained. So there's definitely, whilst what Liam was saying is absolutely correct, that the fine structure as well is also quite scary.
Yeah, that was a nice overview, and yeah, it's one of those that absolutely needs to be taken seriously. Maybe just because you said something interesting before we started, which is people need to have already started their prep for this. How do people go about starting their prep to get DORA compliant? Like what teams need to be involved, what people need to be involved? Because my experience of dealing with, say, like GDPR and things like coming in, it's never just like one team in isolation. You suddenly realize actually we maybe need risk, procurement, legal, finance, that whole raft of different teams to get joined up, and sometimes in siloed organizations there's always a challenge there.
Yeah, and actually I suppose the first point is that if organizations are at that stage now, they need to recognize the pressure they're under. If we look across our clients that we've dealt with over the last year, say, all of them are disciplined financial entities that would have robust security controls in place and continuity controls in place. It's not like they're, not rigorous in what they do already. And yet the DORA baseline and benchmark has required them to typically implement projects that are taking, 6 to 12 months. And when we go into then, say, the larger financial institutions that, just for our organizations, larger financial institutions, many of them started their DORA projects back in 2022. their implementation. To some extent, I suppose, as organizations that are starting now benefit from, if they do go for support from, Mazars or another professional service firm, we've kind of gone through it so many times now that they benefit from others having, paid to create the initial artifacts.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
It's like
so
spin.
they can kind of leverage that, right? But it's still, typically, well, the stages we would go through, it's okay, let's scope it first. So there are some opportunities to reduce the scope, but it's really for micro enterprises, and we can quickly negate that. And then DORA has a number of categories, but the level of difference between effort is quite small between them. So there is probably a scoping conversation, but generally everybody has the whole thing applied to them. Then you're into a gap analysis and developing a roadmap, and into implementation. We're finding for most mid-sized financial entities, the gap analysis, where you're going through the legislation and seeing if operationally their current policies and procedures are compliant with that, and they're not, because these are new standards. That's taking maybe 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the size of the organization.
Yeah.
So if you look at it now, if it's say you start a 10-week project in June, really with the summer months, you're talking about maybe having your roadmap developed by September.
Yeah.
And then having 3.5 months to the 17th of January 2025 to be compliant. So the process is scope it, which is very brief. Do the gap analysis, the roadmap, which maybe you can accelerate, but you certainly don't want to say, well, we're taking the foot off the kind of accelerator over the summer. And then you're into actually, implementing on those the mitigation actions to address those gaps, which everybody has had for us. So yeah, then actually, I think, Daniel, your question was broader than that.
No, honestly, that was a good answer. And I mean, actually, just as you were saying that, in terms of that gap analysis, are you spotting any trends in terms of where organizations do have those gaps, or is it complete randomness?
Yeah. Absolutely, you say, because you're closer to that.
Yeah, I think generally what we've seen is kind of weaknesses in IT risk management. Organizations who have an IT kind of risk tolerance and risk appetite statements that really are quite siloed and kind of to say, well, how are our SLAs? What's our uptime? Is everything kind of operating effectively? Yeah. And they have, we're always seem to have greens all over our assessments. Yeah, and we're really just kind of just looking at, have we had a kind of cybersecurity incident? So really that's kind of the starting point of it. So we're not kind of looking at our risk properly. We're not looking at outside of attacks and uptime. We're not really kind of delving deeper into what our risk threshold is there. Outside of that as well, there's generally some weaknesses even just with like asset management. Organizations not having kind of full knowledge over kind of what assets they have and how the criticality of those assets, which is surprising really, because you can't know what your risks are if you don't know what your assets are. So that then obviously limits their ability from a operational perspective to actually conduct risk assessments of their entire organization from an ICT perspective, because they don't really know what they're dealing with. So I think that's been a significant one. Outside of that, you're going to have your standard gaps that many organizations will have. There's new contractual requirements in your DORA that need to be embedded, things like that. New kind of documentation. It's like a digital operation resilience strategy. Many organizations don't have one because it's relatively new kind of named document. So they're kind of maybe some of the more common ones that we're spotting along the way.
Yeah, probably on that contract piece, we're finding that clients who are well organized now are building in the DORA components into contracts that there's for procurement processes that are taking place this year. So, there's a risk that you're going to have to go back. Like if you say contract in the summer of 2024, knowing the DORA obligations, then that's agreed. Whereas if you go back to an organization in 2025 and say, we now want to change our contract to implement these, there's probably a regulatory requirement to do so. But if they're a technology provider and they're not used to dealing with a financial supervisor, they may be like, okay, so what you're saying is you want to open up the contract and have a discussion about us doing more. Sure, happy to do that. There's a cost associated.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point, because I know that as soon as you said that, I was going to jump on that. So Liam, I'm glad you went on to that.
Yes.
So with regards to the contract side of things, is there potential for any standardization around the contract clauses, or are organizations kind of just having to draft everything in house and then get that agreed? What's the outlook for that?
I think there's definitely scope for a level of standardization. There's standard reasons why you would say terminate a contract, for example, which is set out in DORA. So those are all kind of key controls that could be standardized. Maybe where there's kind of some scope for changes on things like SLAs, that sort of thing, where it's going to be dependent on the third party, the service they're providing. But absolutely, there's scope for a standardization there. Nothing at the moment. So some organizations are going out and addressing that in their themselves at the moment. But I mean, we've seen with GDPR, there was no contract. Many organizations went out, they paid for these contracts to get developed, and then the European Data Protection Board brings out standard contractual clauses that we can all then use. So I mean, you'd hope for the same for DORA, but at the same time, if you're looking at changing your contract at this stage, in line with what Liam was saying, you kind of want to start building in those requirements now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, don't wait for something to come your way. You need to be super proactive on that. And Liam is a good point, right? Like, people will be putting in place contracts right now that need to be DORA compliant, and actually that's probably a very quick fix to get those contracts, to get the word in the contracts compared to a lot of the other requirements.
Actually, Daniel, sorry, I'll speak to think you asked a question about which teams should be involved.
Teams. Yeah, I was going to circle back.
I didn't answer that. So, I think we're seeing generally that, technology is involved. There's often a cyber or security specific team within the technology or the risk function. The risk and compliance function are involved. The core, operation team leaders are involved. Where we have struggled with clients is where there is intergroup services provided. So you're a European financial services entity, you're part of a global organization that has US-based IT shared services. And we've really struggled on occasions to get the US-based IT team to engage and understand and take seriously the need to get this done. And we've struggled on occasion in those instances to get the documentation and to get the buy-in to change, because I think they just, we really need to engage those stakeholders early in the project mobilization and get executive level buy-in in the States, or we end up spinning our wheels. So it's been a struggle on occasions. I think if you have everything within Europe, then it's sometimes simpler, but you obviously don't control that if you're an organization that's US based.
Yeah, it's a good point. No, I appreciate you going back to that, because it already is it's a huge amount of. I've always found, like, in organizations, no matter what, as soon as you have to corral a few teams together, the project always gets a lot harder.
Yeah,
different voices, different personalities, different objectives. Even though you're all kind of working to the same thing, you're kind of not at the same time. So that was super useful. Austin, you did touch on something that I wanted to come back to in terms of sort of the 5 areas. And one of those was, and please correct me if I kind of butchered this, but it was third-party risk and third-party ICT. Could you kind of, our audience deals with a lot of third parties and vendors, partners, things like that. Could you maybe run through some of the maybe key challenges, best practices, things that you're seeing your clients at the moment? How are they approaching that supplier-vendor relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose just to give a little bit of overview of that pillar itself. So it's kind of broke down into your kind of contracts, then kind of broke down into just kind of general kind of management of third-party risk, having a policy, strategy, that sort of thing. And then there's kind of a level of risk assessment in terms of then actually kind of engaging with kind of your third parties. So it sets out quite a normal kind of life cycle for third-party management. So pre-contract, you're doing your due diligence. You're obviously then kind of moving towards putting the contract in place. And then it's kind of setting out really kind of normal monitoring controls that need to be there. So where they kind of maybe have changed with DORA is there's a lot of requirements of sort of say inspection and access rights to be part of your contract.
Yes.
But also then leveraged right? So one of the things that DORA kind of has is that you predetermine the frequency of these audits as well. So really kind of where I kind of envision there being challenges here is that organizations are going to have, particularly if you work in a third party kind of role, or if you work with procurement, your role is now going to have to factor in that we're going to have to make sure we've done all our due diligence, make sure our contract is in line, make sure that we have all of our kind of audits pre-planned, all of this kind of ongoing maintenance and monitoring work, making sure we have our exit plans in place, that we test them on a regular basis, have we defined who our alternative suppliers are. There's a lot of kind of work kind of that I anticipate from like a management perspective from those departments, which, you know, you would hope organizations wouldn't just have like an Excel spreadsheet for that sort of thing. You kind of would hope that there's a level of kind of reminder, because it's quite onerous, you know, if you have to remember that this needs to be tested for this client on an annual basis. These are the dates, so we need to do this audit at this specific date. It's quite a lot. It's quite onerous.
Yeah, it is a good point. And the fact that, you know, you actually have to act on these, you would have seen it. And I've put hundreds of contracts in place over the last few years. And we're just chucking an audit clause in there. And it does feel like a checkbox, like a tick box exercise, especially Leo, I think you mentioned you have to go beyond ISO 27001. And I can recall having some supply chain requirements like, oh, do you have audit clauses in your contracts? Yeah, but we're probably not going to do anything about it. And like, they're just going to sit there and we'll tick that box and say, yeah, we have the right to audit. You know, how I've kind of seen this, I guess, like digital supply chain stuff kind of come about over the last few years. You know, and I've done a lot of work in sort of aerospace and manufacturing. All of that kind of stuff is the norm. Like, you have pre-planned audits, you do all of this stuff, and there's a lot of rigor around it, because, you know, when you're building stuff that can hurt people if it goes wrong, there's a bit more on the line. And our digital supply chains have kind of lagged behind that. And I think you set it out quite nicely at the start, Liam, as well, talking about the whole nature of the world and deglobalization and cyber risk accelerating. It kind of makes sense that we are focused on these areas now.
I think, Daniel, as well, what, you know, we find is that it's extremely costly to audit third parties. And so, you know, really what's required is a classification methodology. Okay, so who are your lower, medium, higher risk, ultra high risk vendors? And what is the strategy to due diligence for each of those groups? Because, you know, it could be as simple as sending a self-assessment questionnaire, and at least then you have them on the hook for committing that they said these things were the case. You know, they said they had X, Y, and Z in place. You know, to then the next level could be asking to see some documentation to evidence that, and policies and procedures, and doing desktop review. You know, it's only really the very, very high risk ones that you're going to get into doing actual audits on, because they are expensive and troublesome. And of course, most vendors then are going to look to use, you know, if you're a vendor that has multiple clients asking to do similar type audits, they'll want to do one third-party assurance type piece of work, such as, you know, a SOC 2 or some other standard control review that they can give to everybody and say, look, we had this independent party do a kind of general review, and that can help as well. But yeah, so it's probably not, there is the weakness in we have the audit clause, we don't use it, but there's also probably the simplicity of it's nothing or it's an audit.
Yeah, there is. It is a really good point. And it's good to draw attention to it. Now, I'm going to go a little bit off our script here to really ask, you know, is there anything that I've not asked you yet that you think, you know, people should know, that you kind of want to scream about? Maybe something that, you know, at Mazars that you're seeing, where people need to think about, because I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on DORA. I've done a lot of reading, kind of terrified me about the scale of it, to be honest. And as I was reading it, I just thought, you know, I'm glad I'm not in sort of my previous contract management role, where I would no doubt have to deal with a lot of this, especially the contracting part didn't scare me, but the rest did. Is there anything that kind of springs to mind here?
I suppose, I don't know if we have said it already. I think, like, financial institutions have been heavily regulated for their entire existence. This is just another piece of regulation. Right? So they have the culture and the approaches and the methodologies to take, you know, compliance requirements and to get them through their machine and get out the other side.
Yeah.
But I just don't know. I think their IT teams have underestimated generally the amount of effort required for DORA, and then the management teams who are, who are internally having these conversations don't recognize that there is necessarily going to be a problem. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. Like the other thing, of course, is that if you buy into the driver for DORA, which is the risk level has increased, you can either approach this as a compliance, project and say, we've ticked the box, we have this document in place. The outcome that you get from this will be dependent upon how willingly and fully you invest in actually delivering on your policy. So, Austin was saying to me earlier this morning, you could do a risk assessment on a yearly basis and not get that engaged with it, and maybe not have all the right stakeholders, not trying to sell that much, and you'd be able to say you've done it, you tick the box, you have a document. But actually, if you truly believe that the risks are changing, and we believe they are, and you actually do need to review your profile on a yearly basis and the types of risks, and you engage with that proactively, you'll probably end up bringing in additional controls and increasing the robustness of your environment. So I think two messages. One is IT folks don't seem to have recognized how significant a challenge DORA is, and they're the ones who others in the organization are taking heed from. I think that's a worry. And the second is, if you buy into this, we could see it really protecting organizations. However, they could ultimately end up just trying to tick a box. And they're probably the two biggest warnings that we would see. I don't know, Austin, would you add anything to that?
No, I think
what you said there.
No, I think you've absolutely covered that. I think buying in, committing, I'm repeating my point from this morning. It's a very good call.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I like loads of things that I've already said, so.
That's how it works, right? If he's in your team. Yeah. So everyone with you. Guys, I'm very conscious of time. I'm very conscious it's a Friday afternoon. And I've learned so much, by the way, just listening to the two of you talk. And I have been reading about DORA for 6 months just out of my general nerdiness around regulatory environments, because I'm a bit of a geek like that. What I did want to ask, though, is if someone is listening to this and they're like, oh, I don't think our business is doing much around this, or we've got a particular challenge with our supply chain around this, how can they get in contact with the two of you to potentially support them on this?
Sure. Well, and we have DORA teams throughout Europe, and there's Ellen McKenna at mazars.ie.
Also
look us up on the website mazars.ie, and I'm certainly listed there, so you can reach out to me directly, and Austin myself typically then have a catch-up call and see how we can help.